Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, today's webinar chair. I am a contractor supporting the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Today's webinar, titled How to Select Energy Projects, is the fifth webinar of the 2020 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website in about 1 week. Copies of today's presentation slides will be posted to the Office of Indian Energy's website shortly after this webinar, if not before, but I believe they aren't posted yet. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and recording will be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted. We will answer your written questions at the end of the final presentation. You can submit a question at any time by clicking on the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. Let's get started with opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and the deployment supervisor for the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs. The deployment program, which she manages on behalf of the office, is national in scope, and even though she is duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. Specifically, the deployment program includes financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and outreach. She also implements national funding opportunities and administers some of the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has over 25 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for the last 20+ years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and pursued a Master's in Business Administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizana, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I join James in welcoming you to today's webinar. This webinar series is sponsored by the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, otherwise referred to as the Office of Indian Energy for short. The Office of Indian Energy directs, fosters, coordinates, and implements energy planning, education, management, and programs that assist tribes with energy development, capacity building, energy infrastructure installation, reducing energy costs, and electrification of Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, our deployment program works within the department, across government agencies, and with Indian tribes and organizations to help Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a three-pronged approach, consisting of financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and capacity building. This Tribal Energy webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. The webinar series is also part of the Office of Indian Energy's efforts to support fiscally responsible energy business and economic development decision-making and information sharing amongst tribes. It is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, to highlight tribal energy case studies, which you'll hear a couple today, and to identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. The previous webinars in this year's webinar series have focused on high-level energy planning, such as understanding energy technology options and developing a strategic energy plan. In today's webinar, we will narrow the focus and share approaches to evaluating and selecting energy projects. We will have two presentations discussing some commonly used tools and methodologies for helping you consider various options and in making those decisions. These presentations will be followed by two tribal case studies. We hope the webinar and the series as a whole is useful to you. We also welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there are ways we can make the series better. Before I turn it back to James, I wanted to personally thank the presenters for giving up their time and in preparing for and presenting on today's webinar. Thank you. And with that, the virtual floor is yours, James.
Thanks, Lizana. Before we get to the presentations, I will introduce today's presenters. For our first presentation, we will hear once more from Lizana, who I've already introduced. Following Lizana, we will hear from Tony Jimenez. Mr. Jimenez has been at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory since 1996. He has expertise in performance and economic modeling of wind, photovoltaics, and hybrid system projects, project pre-feasibility analysis, and wind and solar data analysis. His current assignments include coordinating NREL's activities under the DOE Tribal Technical Assistance Program, which is sponsored by the Office of Indian Energy, and providing support to various DOD projects. Past NREL work includes leading the Small Wind Regional Test Center project and renewable energy project pre-feasibility analysis on behalf of a variety of clients. Tony is a retired Army Reserve engineer officer. In his 2 overseas deployments, he served as a project manager with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Iraq and Director of Public Works for U.S. Army installations in Kuwait. Following Tony, we will hear from Anthony Jacoby, Director of Seneca Energy. Mr. Jacoby has over 15 years experience in corporate strategic planning, project management, sales and marketing, and policy making with various national corporations. He has served as the Director of Seneca Energy at the Seneca Nation in New York for the past 6+ years and has experience with distributed generation projects, natural gas and electric supply, natural gas distribution, maintenance and expansion, right-of-way negotiations, rate analysis, and energy efficiency initiatives. Anthony received his Bachelor's of Science degree from Clarkson University and received a graduate business degree from Canisius College. Our final presenter is Arvind Patel. Mr. Patel is the Executive Director for the Pueblo of Acoma Utility Authority. He has served in that capacity for the past 6 years, but has worked for the Pueblo of Acoma since 2005 within the tribe's environmental department, planning and engineering department, and now with the utility authority. The Pueblo of Acoma, through its utility authority, is currently focusing its efforts to own, operate, and manage all the utilities that provide service to the community with the goal of exercising tribal sovereignty and economic development. This is highlighted by the formation of the Pueblo of Acoma Utility Authority Electric Department. The Pueblo is in the final stages of separating from their electric cooperative, acquiring the electrical facilities, and providing retail sales of electricity and operation and maintenance of the electrical system through a tribally owned transmission tap and substation. Other endeavors of the Pueblo of Acoma Utility Authority is the development of high-speed internet to the entire community and the formation and operation of an internet service provider company. Thanks to each of our presenters for making the time to join us today. With that, let's get started with our first presentation. Now back to Lizana for her presentation on methodologies to evaluate energy options.
Thank you, James. And hello again, everyone, and welcome. As James stated as part of his introduction, my name is Lizana Pierce, and I've had the privilege and the honor of supporting tribes with their energy development for the last 20 years or so. Today, I'll provide a methodology or process one can use to evaluate energy options. It is specifically modeled after the energy options analysis required as part of applications to our competitive funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs. Basically, we'll go over the template provided as an instructions or methodology to conduct an energy options analysis. Also, I'll say that the template is available on the Exchange website with our currently posted funding opportunity announcement that now closes July 30th. However, if you're interested, we could also post it, I believe, with the template and the slides and the recording of this webinar. So just let us know if that's something of interest. Next slide, please. As I said, this process or methodology is based on the template provided as part of our funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs. However, an energy options analysis is not just a requirement of the FOA, it's also an important part of all energy planning. Basically, an energy options analysis is a systematic assessment and evaluation of possible alternative approaches available for achieving specific energy objectives. It's intended to explore all feasible energy options and to identify the best solution to achieve your specific energy objectives. Next slide, please. So generally, this is a concept and not a specific process. However, we're going to show it sequentially Initially, you would identify your energy objectives, you'd set specific project goals, identify your options, establish an approach, conduct a preliminary screening and a pre-feasibility analysis, and ultimately select the best solution to achieve those specific objectives. We'll go through each of these steps in the remainder of the presentation. I provided a link where the template can be found at the bottom of the slide, but again, if there's interest, we can, I believe, post it with the webinar slides as well. Next slide, please. So to begin the energy options analysis, you'll need to determine your energy objectives. What do you want out of an energy project or projects? Included here are a few actual examples of objectives different tribes have established, and you should hear more during the two case study presentations later. But for example, a priority of a tribe or Alaska village might include economic development, or it could be net zero energy, or minimizing life cycle costs of energy, for example. Next slide, please. So here's a few examples. Again, the tribe might want to increase resiliency or the ability to operate autonomously in the event of severe weather conditions, or in the case of California, where the utility shuts down and shuts down the grid for fire hazards. Or another objective might be that the projects align with the tribe's long-term energy vision. Again, these are just examples. The objectives are going to be unique and specific to each community and each tribe, and you'll have to identify those initially in this process. Next slide, please. And in the process, you might also want to identify secondary objectives. Here, again, are a few examples. They might include workforce development, providing educational opportunities to your members, building internal capacity, or just being able to expand the project, the initial project, to other buildings, for example. Next slide, please. Secondly, you would want to identify a very specific quantifiable metrics that contribute to those objectives that you've just identified. For instance, you may wish to provide power to critical facilities during an emergency. For example, you might want to self-generate power for the entire community buildings, or reduce costs by a specific amount, or reduce fuel consumptions by a particular percentage, etc. So what's next? After you've identified your objectives and set specific quantifiable goals, the next step is to identify your energy options. Generally, that includes Generally, that includes a variety of options. The first might be doing nothing, or your current state, which might be just continuing to purchase power from your local utility. The second would be doing something minimal, such as maybe adding some energy efficiency measures to the administration building to reduce energy consumption. Next slide, please. Or the third is the do something option, which may include substantial investments and include a variety of options, both conventional energy generation and or renewable energy systems, or combination. Next slide, please. So again, if you're going through your various options, the current state, do minimum, and do something. For instance, in the current state option example, tribal facilities or residential consumers served by ABC utility with a load of 7.7 million kilowatt hours at an annual cost of $800,000. That's your current state. A do minimal option might be implementing energy efficiency measures in the community buildings and homes at a cost of $1 million, resulting in energy savings of 10% annually. Again, as you notice, these are pretty specific. Or installing 2 gensets at $1 million with negligible reductions over your current costs. Another example for a do something option might be installing a 1.5 megawatt wind turbine, or it could be a larger wind farm consisting of 10 to 12 wind turbines, or maybe community scale 1 megawatt solar project. Again, these are going to be specific to you and your resources and relative to the objectives that you want to obtain. Next slide. Got it. Okay, so once your options are identified, you'll need to determine an approach. How are you going to evaluate these options? Initially, you might want to conduct a preliminary screening, or one example we saw was collecting vendor proposals, so you could compare the costs and the returns that you receive, or doing some design and modeling and some pre-feasibility analysis. Next slide, please. So this slide just provides a little more detail on the approaches I've just identified. During the preliminary screening, you determine how you were going to screen, what criteria you would use in that evaluation process. In collecting vendor proposals, you might use, in addition to that, you might use the Tribal Energy Atlas, which is posted on the Office of Indian Energy website. It's a interactive map that could provide you some information on resources, transmission, electricity costs, and so forth. In the design and modeling area, I might also say that you could reach out to our office or the Department of Interior's Division of Energy and Minerals for technical assistance to help in some of those assessments. Next slide, please. So during the preliminary screening, we've included in the template a variety of methodologies. You could first screen against your primary and secondary objectives. You could also use a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats. We do have some examples and instructions in the template for that as well. You might look at fatal flaws analysis, or just go through pros and cons of each option. And again, this is sort of the preliminary screening to identify the most probable feasible options. Next slide, please. In carrying out a demand analysis, such an analysis means you must evaluate the need for the project investment. You would assess your current demand, your forecasted future demand, what energy are you going to need 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. The demand analysis would aim to formulate a hypothesis about the project's capacity and size, which are defined by either current demand or forecasted demand. And for each of those identified options, you would need to conduct a demand analysis to find out which options ensure the most suitable project capacity and size in terms of your specific current and future demand. Next slide, please. You'd also want to evaluate your energy resources, whether it be conventional or renewable. Technical potential data for conventional fuels are typically proprietary. However, tribes have access to federal assistance to analyze that fossil fuel potential. You can contact, again, the Office of Interior's Division of Energy and Mineral. They have engineers to provide technical assistance on both conventional and renewable resources. You can contact our office. As I said, we also have the Tribal Energy Atlas, which is an online tool for you to use. We also have technical assistance that's free of charge through ours, and I believe also through Division of Energy and Minerals. So just a few resources that might be useful to you in this process. Next slide, please. During the pre-feasibility analysis, you'd also want to explore technology options. We did recently have the webinar on technology options, which covered some of the more common ones, solar, wind, etc. And that might be a resource as well. Other consideration factors you might look at would be fuel costs, fuel supply, interconnection, logistics, operation, maintenance, training, and all the things that would go into developing a successful project. Next slide, please. So putting it all together, what's next? Okay, so a few methods to compare project options would include the multi-criteria analysis. or cost-effectiveness analysis, for example. The multi-criteria analysis, it's just another way of evaluating and selecting the best project options, comparing those options by using criteria. This kind of analysis lets you deal with a suite of different objectives that can't be aggregated into a single benefit. Specifically, multi-criteria analysis when a project is evaluated by more than just monetary terms. It's in the form of appraisal that, in addition to monetary impacts, measures variables such as material costs, time savings, project sustainability, as well as social and environmental impacts that may be quantified but not easily valued. Cost-effective analysis is a step where the project options are compared relative to the cost and the outcomes. Specifically, a cost-effective analysis is a form of economic analysis that compares the relative costs and outcomes or effects of different courses of action. Cost-effectiveness analysis is distinct from a cost-benefit analysis, which assigns a monetary value to measure that effect. The goal here is to select an option that best meets your objectives. Again, these are just a variety of methods. There's more information in the template, but it gives you an idea of different methodologies you can use as you go through and assess what projects might meet your objectives best. Another method would be to evaluate the economic impact. To be used to select the best project option is to use an economic impact analysis. This could use the levelized cost of energy, rate of return, net present value, or even a simple payback method. Next slide, please. Another consideration when you look at these options is how much involvement and how much risk the tribe wants to take in the project, such as, for example, as a landowner, typically would be for land lease payments and would have minimal risk. On the other end of the spectrum, at the bottom of the slide, is the project developer, which has more investment, more risk, but generally more gains. So there are a variety of levels of involvement that the tribe can take, and I think that that's a decision that the tribe needs to make. How much risk or how much potential gains do they want to explore in each of the projects? I'll pause just a second here to let you review the slide. Next slide, please. So finally, I know this is sort of a brief summary of the process, and again, the template does provide more detailed instructions on how to go through it, but the final step really is to look at all the information and the analysis that you conducted throughout to see which of those options best meet these initial objectives and those project metrics that you established, and making that decision, and to evaluate whether you've really looked at the totality of options, the do nothing, the do minimal, and the do something options, and make a selection on that. Next slide, please. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to pass it back to James.
Thanks, Susanna. Appreciate that good overview of options for looking at selecting projects. Now we're going to get into a few more kind of tools, and those are going to be presented by Tony Jimenez. Tony, go ahead once your slides are up.
And I just have to jump in and apologize. The slides are frozen on my screen, so Tony, give me a minute.
All right, well, we start with the overview, and hopefully the slides will catch up. So good day, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about techno-economic modeling, or TEM, as I call it, and it's with particular focus on energy and renewable energy projects, just to narrow the scope a little bit. I'm basically going to hit three main topics: techno-economic modeling overview. I'll talk a little bit about specific models and data resources that are out there, and then I'll take you through a quick example using the system advisor model, the NREL SAM model. I guess I'll pause here till the slides catch up.
I am so sorry, PowerPoint crashed on me. So give me a minute.
Okay.
I would say, this is James. We've received several requests for that template Lizana spoke of, so we're going to try to post that with your slides as soon as we can get all the material posted after the webinar. And you'll receive an email with all the attendees will receive an email just notifying that that the material has been posted, and there'll be a link included to the website where both the slides and any additional material we're able to post will be available. I can see.
All right, great. You can stop at that slide. That'll be good. So what is techno-economic modeling? So I give you my kind of off-the-cuff definition on the top of the slide. It's basically the process or procedure to estimate the technical and economic performance of a proposed or envisioned energy project. So basically, how was it going to perform, and what are the economics? Is kind of the two big questions that these models are designed to answer. The techno-economic models mostly focus on the first two of those three bulleted items. However, there's a lot of kind of a third category would be other considerations. What are the practical considerations to actually doing the project? And the models tend not to address that as much. So you need to make sure you bring that to the table as the analyst. And why do you do the modeling? Essentially to inform your decision making. So next slide, please. So I'll give you a quick example. And one thing is the modeling can cover a wide variety of a wide spectrum of detail, from back of the envelope, which I'm going to do right now, to excruciating detail. And usually it's an iterative process. So you'll do your back of the envelope first to say, okay, is there enough of it there to worth the effort to do more modeling? Or did you find some showstopper and you're just going to move on to the next thing? So here's your example. You're considering PV for your tribal store, calling it the Woodlands Market, and you're located just north of Redding, California. You have the grid coordinates. Your average monthly consumption at the store is 80,000 kilowatt hours a month, and your store has a flat roof with an area of 12,000 square feet. So typical questions that I've gotten when I've done this type of modeling: what size PV system do you need so that your annual production matches your annual consumption? That's doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go with that size system, but at least it helps you answer the so what. How much will the system matter? How big of a system can I actually get on my roof? And what's the estimated capital cost? Those certainly aren't all the questions you want to answer, but these are probably initial ones that you want to answer. Next slide, please. So this is the process. So 80,000 kilowatt hours a month. That's 960,000 kilowatt hours a year. It's about 2,600 kilowatt hours a day, an average load of about 110 kilowatts. And I just like to have all those metrics because sometimes I get stuff in per day or average load, and that way I can just do a quick comparison. Your solar resource, go to your handy dandy solar atlas, and I'll show you a resource later on. The color coding for your location shows a solar resource of about 4.75 to 5 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day on a horizontal surface. So being slightly conservative, you're going to assume on the low end of that, and we'll assume 4.8 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day. All right. The nice thing about PV is you can multiply your solar resource times your panel rating or your array rating to estimate production. So if you have a 1 kilowatt PV array, you just multiply by that 4.8 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day, and you get average daily production. Ooh, and I have a mistake there. All right, no, I don't. You get about 4.8 kilowatt hours per day per kilowatt of PV capacity. You can divide that by your daily consumption, your average daily consumption, 2630. Divide that by 4.8, and you get about 550 kilowatts of PV capacity that you need. It would equal your consumption. And I'm saying that probably rather clumsily because that doesn't mean it can meet your load and you can cut the wires to the utility, because sometimes the array will be producing more than you need, and sometimes it'll be producing less. You still, unless you want to have periods where you're not getting enough power or any power, you still need to be connected to the grid. So I want to make that really clear. If you want to cut the wires to the grid, you're going to need batteries and probably a somewhat oversized array. All right, so how much can you get on your roof? Well, a rule of thumb, get about 10 watts. For roof-mounted systems, 10 watts or about 0.01 kilowatts per square root of roof space. A secondary rule of thumb, you can probably plan on being able to use about 2/3 of your roof space. You're not going to be able to tile the whole roof with paneling. And so you do the math, 12,000 times 0.01 times 2/3, and you get about 80 kilowatts of PV capacity that can fit on your roof. So about 1/7 of what it would take to meet your whole load. And next is the capital costs. Give some benchmarks there from the latest market reports. And so for if you do the 550 kilowatt system, let's say you say, oh, well, I got enough ground space to do it. You're talking about $1.3 million. If you're limited to what's on your roof, or you just want to do the roof mounted system, you're looking at about $250,000. So now, if this was something that your boss assigned you to do, you have some specifics. You can go back and say, okay, here's the rough numbers. Is this worth pursuing further? Is 1/7 of the consumption from a rooftop system, is that enough? Is that enough the consumption to be worth it? Do we have enough land to do a bigger ground mounted system? Can we raise the money? All that good stuff. So that's kind of your back of the envelope, and that's an example of techno-economic modeling on the very simple end. And we'll carry this example forward later on in the presentation. All right, next slide, please. So why use a techno-economic modeling tool? Basically, they do a lot of the tedious math. PV arrays in particular, there's a lot of geometry if you want to do an hour-by-hour calculation of what you're producing based on the sun angles. It's a lot easier to have the computer do it than to do it by hand. You can do hourly simulation. You can do detailed economics. You can have a lot greater precision. You can do sensitivity analysis. What if my costs are high or low? Some tools, call them optimization tools, will actually help you size components, such as if you're doing a hybrid system, what size battery bank should I have? What size PV array, or at least what are the lowest cost options? And finally, a lot of the tools have links to or defaults for resource data, cost data, and some even have links to tariff data. So they bring a lot more to the table and let you do a much more detailed analysis. Once your initial scoping indicates that it's something you want to look at in more detail. Next slide, please. So these are just some common questions. And for renewable energy projects, I'll group them into two broad buckets. One is facility scale, where your intent is really to meet your load. And so from a financial perspective, you're usually looking at how, will I save money compared to just continuing to buy from my local utility. Utility scale, you're more looking, how does this work from a business? Will I make a profit? How big of a profit? Those sorts of things. So a lot of commonalities between the two, but a few differences that you want to consider. And this is just a listing, certainly not an exhaustive listing of questions that people or yourself may ask to answer in the modeling. So next slide. This next one is a little bit messy. I apologize for that, but basically it's the analysis flow, especially if you're using a techno-economic modeling tool. And so the tool itself is kind of inside the red dotted box there. It'll basically do two things for you. It'll estimate the technical performance, and then a lot of that information then feeds into your economic performance, and then spits it out, as your outputs. And so the boxes on the outside are basically information you need to feed into your modeling. So where are you? That's not necessarily that your grid coordinates determine anything. Usually they're related to your resource information. I'm at XYZ coordinates, so my wind resource is this and my solar resource is that. If you're doing facility modeling, what's my consumption? What are the net metering rules? What am I currently paying the utility? How much am I going to pay for the system? How much does it cost to maintain? How big of a system is it? What's the lifetime? What's the expected lifetime? And business structure. If you're doing residential PV, that might be, am I going to buy it or lease it? If you're going to sell to the utility, you can do lots of very exotic business structures to try to maximize the financial gain from the project. So this is kind of the flow. Most models, most tools require kind of the same types of inputs. They will differ in the level of detail and how the inputs are entered. And usually getting the information is usually the most painful part of the analysis process, the most time consuming. Next slide, please. So some sources of information if you're basically starting from scratch. So thank you. These are a sampling of models that are out there. I'll talk them over very briefly. This certainly does not exhaust the universe of modeling tools that exist, but these are the ones that I either use or at least know about. So the PV Watts does PV only. There's a website, a very simple model. You can go on there and literally do a quick analysis in 10 minutes or less. It's really fast. System Advisor model does multiple technologies, a lot of different technologies, CSP, whatever, and lots of different scales, facility scale or utility scale. RETScreen is a Canadian model. I would say it's broadly comparable to SAM, and there's at least a partial free, at least a viewer mode they call it that is available for free. There's REOP Lite. That's another NREL model. That's an optimization model, so you don't even have to specify the system. You more just put costs like PV is X dollars per kilowatt, battery is X dollars per kilowatt hours of storage, and it will and other information, and it will spit out the lowest cost model or the lowest cost system for you. And finally, the last one I'll talk about is Homer. That was actually originally developed at NREL, but it was spun off to a separate company, available from Homer Energy. Unfortunately, there's no free version available, but it's mostly for microgrid modeling. And I basically tell whether it's free or not, the source, who owns it, and whether it's an optimization model or what I call a simulation model. Again, the difference with a simulation model is you have to specify the system, this size PV array, this size battery bank, these all that sort of stuff. Whereas with the optimization models, it's much more generic, and it says you should go with this size. One of the outputs is you should go with this size battery bank, this size PV array to have a lowest cost system. I will say that the lowest cost, usually informs your decision making, but it's certainly not the only thing that goes into the decision making. Next slide, please. Here are some sources of resource data. Just to give a little bit of the background. NREL, the NREL website has a suite of resources, of resource information. I'll kind of divide them up into three categories of just static maps, something like a PDF where you just go and look at it. data sets that you can grab and manipulate, especially for GIS. And then there's kind of what I'll call the data visualization and geospatial tools. So this is kind of like a GIS that works on, via your web browser. And there's a couple dozen in there, biomass, vehicles, you name it, there's probably something that related to it. Good starting points, for kind of more general work is the Tribal Energy Atlas. Then there's the Renewable Energy Atlas, and those first two are there's a lot of overlap, I guess I'll say, between the two, some differences, and I usually have to bounce between the two. And then if I'm doing utility scale wind, I like Wind Prospector because it has the color coding is more specific or more defined. With Renewable Energy Atlas, it's more just shades of blue. With Wind Prospector, you got pinks and purples and reds, and it's a little bit easier to use if you're. I find it a little better if you're doing wind specific stuff. All right, next slide. So here's just a screenshot from the Tribal Energy Atlas. You can select you have a lot of choice of data layers, and then they'll show up on the legend, and you can scroll in and out to very, very, house level, focus on a specific house, or go up, to the country as a whole. And this shows basically the PV resource within different reservations. Next slide. And this is kind of the same one, the same area in the Renewable Energy Atlas, showing kind of the renewable energy resource. If I'm at point XYZ, my resource is this, and basically showing the states and the reservation boundaries. So good places to go if you need a starting point for resource data. Next slide. Other big category is cost data. There's a lot of market reports that are out there. Unfortunately, most of them cost. These are ones that are free. The first two are Lazard's. Those kind of high level, come out every year, but compare a lot of different technologies. You can compare, offshore wind with diesel generators, for example. So it covers, gives you a high level cost for a lot of different technologies. The bottom four are all DOE funded and then put up by various national labs. Tracking the Sun covers basically distributed PV up to 5 megawatts, utility scale solar, and then kind of comparable publications for utility scale wind and distributed wind. So you can go in there and see the costs. Want to be a little bit careful for technologies where the costs are changing fast, especially with solar. These come out almost about 9 months after the year that they're covering. So costs usually come down. So you want to read the fine print carefully. But they're good starting points. If you plug in the numbers, you're probably being a bit conservative on the economics, but that's probably okay for a first cut. Next slide. This is a screenshot from Tracking the Sun 2019 edition, just showing PV cost trends over time and giving you kind of average costs for different size systems in terms of cost per watt. Next slide. All right. Last thing I'm going to drag you through is an example analysis. We're going to kind of do the next iteration from our earlier example. So again, we're going to analyze the 80 kilowatt rooftop system. So next slide, please. And again, I'll just reiterate that getting the needed inputs is typically the most time-consuming part of the analysis. So I have three slides of facts and assumptions, and this is not a SAM tutorial. Most of these tools have lots and lots of resources, teaching tools, hours of YouTube videos and user manuals and whatnot, but just to kind of give you a sense of the types of inputs that at least go into one model. So start listing all the information you have. This is kind of general site information and load information. You don't really need the roof area for SAM, but it's just good to have there, when you're briefing your boss. Next slide, please. Slide 2 of the 3. This is system information. So I'm assuming a 30-year system, 80 kilowatts, fixed tilt, still 10 degrees, so just enough for it to wash off, and some other array losses. A lot of them are just the SAM defaults. Next slide. And finally, cost, and this is where you're kind of assuming how am I paying for this. So in this case, I'm assuming the assumption is you're going to write a big check for 25% of the cost and finance the rest, 5% interest rate, 20-year loan, assuming no taxes because it's a tribally owned system, and a loan term of 20 years. So those are kind of all the inputs for this kind of initial model run. Next slide, please. So these next few slides are going to just be screenshots from SAM. Most of them are not the complete window, but I got feedback when I did a draft of this presentation these are hard to read, so I decided to just take parts of the screens so they're actually legible. SAM has a bunch of specific models within it, so you need to choose a performance model and a financial model. So you can see, it does PV, it does wind, it does concentrated solar power, geothermal, etc. And then there's various financial models. So in this case, I'm choosing kind of the simple PV model, PV watts, and a fairly straightforward, commercial financial model. But you can see if you can explore some various exotic business structures if you so desire. Next slide. So this is the location and resource window, and I've put in a red box kind of the windows that you step through in SAM to enter your information. So you'll just kind of enter all those in, and then at the end there's the bottom left. You can hit run, and it runs the model. Let's see, anything else? So in this case, a lot of models have a resource library. So once you, it'll go to a NASA database or NREL database and pull in the data you need. Especially pretty common to be able to get PV data. Wind may be a little bit more hit and miss. The other resources, it's much more hit and miss typically. But solar data is typically fairly easy to get. Next slide. So this is this is where you specify your system size, your inverter, your ratio, your inverter of your panels to your inverter. That's the 1.2. Some efficiency, tilt, how's it oriented, all that good stuff. One common way to do this, especially PV analysis, is to just specify a system size of 1 kilowatt, and then you just scale the answers to whatever size system you actually care about. And it's just easy to do the math that way. But in this case, I put in 80 to do that particular system. Next slide. This is part of the cost window. As you can see, you can put in a very detailed cost breakdown. I often don't. I'll just roll up everything when I'm using SAM into the module cost at the top right there, and at kind of a high level economics, that's all I really care about is the total cost. If you're a developer or you want to get more details, you usually do cost breakdowns. One possible reason to do that is some of the different cost items are treated differently for tax purposes. But it doesn't. You don't have to use all the details the model offers. And I'll use an example of Excel. Excel does a ton of stuff. Most people probably use about 1% of its capabilities, and that's all they really need. So with these models as well, don't feel you need to use all the detail that's offered. Lifetime, a little bit of a misnomer. It's really your panel degradation rate. So the panels do degrade, and the energy production will decline slowly over time. 0.5% is a very typical default value. Next slide. I'm sorry. So there's your lifetime, your degradation rate. And next slide. Next is you start your financial parameters. In this case, I kept it pretty simple. 75% debt. Analysis period of 30 years. That's about the lifetime of a PV project. Just assume 0 for the tax rates and salvage value, and you can see there was more stuff under the window that I didn't get. Depreciation rates, that sort of thing. Next slide. Incentives. Since it's a non-tax-paying entity, I just assume no incentives as a first cut. But there's tax credits, there's direct cash incentives. There's a lot of different ways in SAM to enter different types of incentives, just because reality is messy, and so the models have to try to, a model that's trying to be really flexible is going to be really complicated because it just has to be to reflect, all the different possible situations, or at least a lot of the possible different situations. Next slide. This is where, since it's a facility size system, you care about it's going to compare to what you're paying now. The do nothing option, as Lizana put it. So this is some of the entries. We'll assume net billing. I should have probably put net metering instead, but it basically, saying that you have 1 meter and it can run backwards if you're producing more than you are using. Next slide. Next is your load. This is another item that could be really detailed or really not detailed. Most models you can enter, you stuck in a file of 8,760 hours, an hourly load file for the whole year. In this case, I kept it simple and just put in the monthly energy consumption, and I made some assumptions on the peak versus the average. And I gave some seasonal variation, so the average is 80,000, a month over the year, but less in the winter, more in the summertime, and assume 0% load growth rate, so that the load is going to be what it is. But again, another place where you can put in high-level information or a lot very detailed information. All right, so this is the last entry window. So now you can just some screenshots of the results. This slide and the next few slides are just screenshots of kind of the main table and some of the charts that show up on the main results page. So this is your main results. In this case, if you go down to the net present value, it's negative $57,000. So it doesn't, from a financial point of view, it doesn't break even. But these are typically the results that you're most interested in. If you have a negative MPV, that gives you a sense of how big of a grant you need for the project to break even, given the financial scenario. It might be, say, well, I could maybe get a bigger loan or try to get some grants or whatever. But at least it starts informing, all right, can you get a grant for $60,000? Well, maybe. And so you keep digging. So just some plots. This is the energy production from the PV array. Get more in the summer, less in the winter. Probably not much of a shocker there. This shows your annual energy production, and you can see 0.5% per year. That may not seem like much, but it's a noticeable decrease over 30 years. But you're still getting quite a bit of production even on year 30. Another big one is your annual cash flow. So here you have your big check you wrote at the beginning for 25% of the system cost. You kind of a little less than break even while you're paying off the loan, and then lots of savings at the back end. So again, this could inform some further thought on financing or looking for grants or whatever. This is your monthly kind of average monthly result. I think for your first year, the blue is the energy production and the gray is your load. So you can see you're meeting, a part of your load. So that's it for the SAM results. So just to recap, TechnoEconomic modeling is the process for estimating the technical and economic performance of a proposed or envisioned project. Sorry, I kept forgetting to say next slide. I apologize. So thank you, Monica. They're very helpful. The tools are really helpful if you want to go beyond a back of the envelope analysis. TechnoEconomic modeling is more than just simply running the tool. You need to leaven it with some sound judgment and some common sense. And I'll just emphasize, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. In this modeling, it's very common to start with a very high-level analysis, like that back of the envelope analysis that I did, and then iterate with more detailed analysis efforts. Usually the worst part is getting the needed information, and there are sources out there that give you resource information and cost information that you can at least use as starting points for your analysis. And so with that, I will turn it back over to James.
Thanks, Tony. Excellent overview there, and a lot of learning that people can do if they dig into the details, I'm sure. But thanks for covering it at a high level to meet the time constraints. All right, next we're going to hear from Anthony Jacoby with the case study of Seneca Energy. Go ahead, Anthony.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Anthony Jacoby. I'm the Director of Seneca Energy at the Seneca Nation. Next slide, please. If you don't know, the Seneca Nation is located in western New York near Lake Erie. There are 5 territories today and 2 primary residential territories that make up about 50,000 acres. You see them highlighted on this slide. You have Cattaraugus and Allegheny. In selecting projects, this causes some unique challenges because we do have to look at both territories that are separated by about 45 minutes and duplicate a lot of efforts. We have different utilities that work on both of these territories, and somewhat different needs from time to time. And also we have 8 counselors that sit at each territory, and then 3 executives that flip basically every 2 years between the Cattaraugus and the Allegheny territory. So for example, our president's in Allegheny currently, and in our next term, the president would be in Cattaraugus. So we've been extremely fortunate to have a lot of continuity over the 6+ years that I've been with the Seneca Nation, and that's really allowed us to move projects forward and ultimately accomplish what we have to date. So it really is the leadership that's had that vision and really helped stress the direction that they would like to see us go. Next slide, please. It really started with a mission statement for us to ensure the security, prosperity, and independence of the Seneca Nation by building a sustainable energy platform and lowering energy costs for the nation and its residents. So, I think it's important to take that time and really craft a mission statement that is the vision. Ultimately the mission statement is going to sit over the organization, and you want to make sure that all of your decisions are really moving you in that direction. So if you start, basically if your decisions start taking you off course, you can really know that. So with all of the decisions that we make, we definitely make sure that these key points are being hit, at least some of them, if not all of them. Next slide, please. This talks a little bit more about the energy vision. I won't talk about all of them, but sustainability and reducing costs, improving infrastructure, the environment and economic development, the workforce development are huge decision criteria and factors for us. Again, our mission is really around this vision and essentially making decisions to check as many of these boxes with every project that we can. Next slide, please. This slide shows with the strategic vision in the middle of the slide, and again, leadership being extremely important in crafting that vision, making sure we're staying on course. Financing, capital investment that we've put in, that we're willing to put in, is always going to be a factor. Project evaluation and selection will be the topic we focus on today. And then team development. I'm lucky that I have 4 great team members that work with me. And again, we wouldn't be able to accomplish the things that we've accomplished and continue to strive for without that team. Next slide, please. This slide I've shown in the past. Today, really talking about that in the bottom left-hand corner, you see highlighted, evaluate and prioritize projects. All of these items essentially are what go into strategic planning and ultimately get you to a point where you can really even try to prioritize projects and evaluate. I think in some cases, maybe the project's coming first and the organization isn't necessarily set up yet. And, that could definitely lead to some trouble down the road. I think creating that foundation, the building blocks, is essential. And we were able to do that. It took a little time, but once we built that foundation, now, we are able to evaluate projects, prioritize our initiatives, and again, a lot of that foundation being there definitely helps moving forward. Next slide, please. Decision criteria, a lot of this was talked about in the 2 presentations prior, but return on investment, IRR, essentially a return on a particular investment, that's really relative to the cost of that investment. Sustainability, resiliency, or sovereignty, however you really want to say that. I mean, essentially, we are making decisions. Sometimes it's not always the economic benefit. I mean, we're not trying to obviously lose money, but sometimes it's for resiliency or because we want, that independence, such as a microgrid. And that's a good example. We're currently working on a microgrid feasibility study that would ultimately allow us to have our main administration complex, our community center, where we store food for the community, all on a separate grid with black start capabilities. And the fact is, it's going to cost money. Over time, we believe it can be economic, but with storage and the size that we will have to build an array, if it is an array, is going to cost obviously significant money to do that. But there are reasons other than economics sometimes to do things. Capital, we talked about. Nation member interest or acceptance is huge. We always have public meetings. We get things in our newsletter, which goes out twice a month, and always just interacting with the community, even just public comment periods for our projects. We try to do that. And for us, the whole purpose is creating projects and implementing projects that are going to benefit the community. So it really doesn't do us a whole lot of good to be implementing projects and spending money where people aren't necessarily interested or really looking for those types of things. So we've had, luckily, a lot of acceptance with our projects, and I think getting that on the front end definitely can make things a lot smoother. And then finally, economic development and workforce development, which is huge for us, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward in the presentation. But we have been able to employ a number of people on our projects, Seneca members, which we're really proud of. Next slide, please. And this is kind of a busy slide, maybe somewhat tough to read, but I'll walk through it a little bit. It's called the decision matrix. This is something we put together. Essentially what we're doing is scoring projects. This is an example. It was a real life example. The numbers aren't exact what they were at the time, but essentially it's a scoring system. At the very, very top, you see a percent. Those are weighted averages. Where it says option, or essentially it's categories. See ROI, gross margin, capital investment, and so on and so forth as you go. And then we essentially use the two legends at the bottom, which are either linguistic values or numerical value, and you can set those sort of parameters how you need. We essentially assign each category a score. It has a weighted average, and you can see on the far right two columns, they end up getting a final score, and then you see that weighted average is kind of a bar chart there. And that has helped us make decisions for sure along the way. It really allows you to put in, I guess, really go through the information. You're not necessarily making an emotional decision. You're using the data, and it's a lot easier to digest when you really lay it out. Really just almost like a strengths and weaknesses type exercise, but we found this to be very helpful. We do find that we're saying no to more projects than we say yes to, and I think you're going to see that. We get a lot of proposals. It could be weekly, definitely monthly, and not always things we're necessarily looking for. And I think you just do want to be careful if you look at all of these things and make sure you're checking the boxes and getting towards the goals that you've set for yourself. I think that's the most important piece of it. Next slide. The next, after this slide, you'll see a project approval flow chart. It essentially takes us through project origination all the way to project approval. You'll see a number of decision points, including the decision matrix, but that's just early on really in the process where we're vetting the project, really doing the due diligence prior to moving on to some of the further approvals. And then you can see we have our permitting process with a number of entities at the nation, our EPD and Natural Resource Committee, TIPO, legal, and then we have our board approval, our BNF approval, and finally council approval. So most, I know, people will be familiar with that type of process, although it'll be slightly different, but you want to make sure you do that due diligence and that decision matrix is important because the further along this process you go, the more time and money you're going to spend. So you really want to bring projects that you're going to be able to, I guess, get to the finish line. Next slide, please. This flow chart shows you the process. Again, a little tough to put on a slide, but shows you really walking through the different regulatory process, or whether it's our Department of Justice, our legal department, Natural Resource Committee. You see the 4 diamonds. Blue diamonds are essentially main decision points, whether it's the board or council. And that I think it's a good graphic because it shows you not everything, but shows you a lot of the steps it's going to take to really move a project from origination all the way to approval. This isn't getting you into actually implementing the project and really working on that project management. So there's definitely a lot that goes into it, and I think understanding that process at your nation is obviously the most important. And I think we've done a good job with being able to projects that get past, I guess, our decision matrix and past Seneca Energy. We have a very high success rate of ultimately having those projects be approved. Next slide, please. These next 2 slides I've shown actually once or twice. I mean, for this presentation, really the first 4, maybe 5 on this slide are very relevant. Again, public outreach, leadership, your champions that are helping to move the project forward, your technology and resource evaluation, site selection, your internal departments, and then also potentially some agency coordination. I will talk about a wind turbine project that some people may have heard about, and we were very happy and lucky to receive an award from DOE, and that helped certainly make that project economic. So if you essentially look at all of those categories, they were talked about in a few of the other presentations, and you can go to that next slide. This is more on the construction, financing, contracting, and then ultimately all the way to post-construction administration, monitoring, and your O&M. Next slide. So these are a number of the projects that we've completed at the Seneca Nation. You can see a number of smaller PV projects with a little small microgrid at our Allegheny Fish Hatchery. We've done a number of LED installations. Really proud of that. We've installed basically every building, almost every light in at our Cattaraugus territory. We're finishing up an Allegheny installation at our ACC with some of our community center, which is larger gyms and indoor boxes, things like that. So we've hit almost all of the buildings and added some other energy efficiency measures, which have helped along the way. And sometimes those are not huge projects. They could be 20,000 if you're doing a couple building or two, to 100,000 if you're doing the majority of your territory. But the payback on a lot of those, I mean, we're seeing 2.5-year paybacks. So we're not having to put in millions of dollars and seeing returns pretty quickly. So those have been really good projects. Talked about the microgrid feasibility study. We had done one previously that we actually did not move forward with, but we did move forward with a solar project instead at that point. Natural gas plugging and abandonment project. We are very happy that we've plugged over 30 wells at the nation that were either leaking gas or different fluids. We've worked on a number of pipelines, either made the utility replace them or we have ourselves. And really, again, with going back to those pillars, environment being one of the most important aspects to the Seneca Nation, and Mother Earth has always been. So we've really taken that and made sure that our vision incorporates those objectives, and we're doing the best that we can between all of our different projects. The Cattaraugus Fiber Broadband Project is actually a current project we're working with. I wanted to put it on here. Not necessarily an energy project, but it does play a role in a couple of different ways. Number one, we have some SCADA systems that are monitoring our systems, monitoring our wind turbine and our solar array We've had situations, our wind turbine system actually goes out quite a bit. We're using a 2 megabit wireless service. We've had a situation where it's went down for a week and we were out of town, not knowing the turbine was down and losing some time a couple of years ago. And every other time, luckily, we've been around and haven't really lost time, but we have to check on it manually versus being able to log into a computer. There are some other opportunities with broadband where we can lease capacity to National Grid, who's the local utility. They've already expressed some interest, as well as some broadband companies in the area that we can lease capacity to essentially get from one side of the territory to the other. They wouldn't actually serve the territory because we would be doing that, but they'd be transporting. Broadband's huge. With the current pandemic that's going on, we've had the situation where people can't work from home, have to go in, and we also have kids that are sitting outside a library and trying to get a wireless signal, to do homework when school is in session. So this is, it's really proven how important that project is, and we're essentially building a 52-mile network that will cover the entire Cattaraugus territory. Negotiating right-of-ways is another one of our responsibilities. So we've worked with a number of broadband and utility companies. And then finally, the wind turbine and solar array. We've installed almost 5 megawatts of renewable power at this point, and those two making up really the bulk of it. Next slide. Just a couple slides more. Essentially showing you on the left the highlights. Those were a lot of our decision points. How are you going to finance the project? You see the DOE grant. We also received some nice CERTA money for that project. What are you going to do with the power? In both of our larger projects, we've virtually net metered. That was the most economic option for us. And just showing you actually that next bullet on highlights is wrong. It's updated on the right side, but we've actually generated almost 10 million kilowatt hours. You see the revenue and some of the other points. The community benefits, I would like to talk about that one because we essentially pay out $25 a month as a credit. We put it right on the utility bill. So there's an investor-owned utility, and everyone who signs up on Cattaraugus territory and actually Steenberg in Allegheny with our solar array will receive a $25 a month credit, which ends up being 25 to 30, 40% sometimes of the bill. We see about $60 to $100 bills most of the time on electric. So it's making a big difference. We've paid out over $375,000 since March of 2017 as part of that program. So we're very proud of that program as well. And a couple of the generation emission stats, you see the production. So that's the equivalent of powering almost 1,400 homes in a single year, or taking off almost 1,500 cars in a year. So again, Mother Earth being so important in the environment, being one of our really in our mission statement, we continually are driving towards those types of statistics. Next slide, please. Just some pictures. Some people may have seen this one as well, but you can see the foundation. And we did put the turbine up in a snowstorm, but we'd waited for quite a while, so we weren't going to wait much longer. And once you start, you basically have to stop, finish it up. So we had some fun doing that, but they got it done, and we had 8 Seneca members working on this project between union operators and iron workers. And the one picture on the right, you can see somebody kind of sticking out of the top of that turbine, but it was pretty cool to see. And again, just having the community involvement was huge. So basically, almost everybody working on this project was from the community. Next slide. The rotor fly, just showing you, this is definitely the best part. They put the blades on the nacelle on the ground and then lift it up with 2 cranes. And essentially there's like 3 people up top that catch barehanded. The crane operator puts the nacelle and it attaches to essentially the nacelle, and they just bolt it in. So that was pretty neat to watch. Next slide, please. some highlights on our solar array, showing you the investment that we made, the nation made, and payback. You know, some of these it was mentioned by Tony, we don't receive tax credits, so we've had to do some different things. That's with the wind turbine, the grants helped. They really made up for those tax credits essentially, and we put in about the same amount, the 3.4, 3.2 on the wind turbine. And then with the solar, we originally put in the 3.4 and then did receive some grant funds back, about $700,000 back. But these projects are definitely a significant investment, and we've been getting a nice return on that investment to date. And we've been able to pay out the credits. We've funded a number of projects as well. A lot of those LED projects have been funded through essentially the department and some of the recurring revenue that we're generating. We've done a number of little other projects as well where we can, helping out the department, essentially not having to ask for more money. So becoming as self-sufficient as possible, which was really our goal. We wanted to get there in a few years, and we've gotten there relatively quickly and have been pretty happy with the progress. Next slide, please. I think I'm almost done. Just an aerial picture, drone picture, 8-acre solar array, about 49 inverters. We have it's about 5,500 panels. So we've produced about 5 million kilowatt hours the last couple of years since its install. Next slide. Just showing a few of the inverters and a close-up of the panels. I believe that's my last slide. So thank you. I appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, Anthony. Excellent presentation and some really interesting stuff you guys have done, and obviously made a lot of decisions on goes and no-goes along the way, I'm sure. So thanks for your insight. Our next presenter, Arvind Patel from Pueblo Vacama. Go ahead, Arvind, when your slides are up.
Thank you, James. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Arvind Patel. I am the Executive Director of the Pueblo Vacama Utility Authority. I've been in this capacity for, since 2010, working on energy projects, energy initiatives here for the Pueblo since 2014. But I've been with the Pueblo through various tribal programs and departments since 2005. So happy to be here today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the Pueblo Vacama. We are one of the 19 Pueblos within the state of New Mexico. Our enrollment is around 5,196 enrolled tribal members, and just under 3,000 of those members here reside on tribal lands. Our tribal leadership structure is by an appointment process that is appointed annually by a group of traditional leaders here on the Pueblo. And an interesting tidbit, the Pueblo Vacama is known, the village area that you see pictured is known there as the oldest continuously inhabited village in North America. Next slide. Our location, we're just about 55 miles west of Albuquerque in west central New Mexico. The Pueblo Vacama currently has 770,000 acres under trust. Quite a little bit of land under trust. I would say maybe a couple hundred thousand acres of land still in fee. But the vast majority of the tribal lands is considered open range, with all of our population, businesses, residential structures, and properties are all located on the northern portion of the tribal lands. We range anywhere between 5,600 to 7,000 feet above sea level, so we're a high mountain desert. We typically have pretty big temperature swings during the days, but we have a lot of good sunlight. As I mentioned, tribal boundaries are contiguous, and we have few checkerboarded areas. And in the recent years, we've acquired lands adjacent to the current boundaries and are in the process of converting those into trust. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the Pueblo Vacama Utility Authority. Right now, we are a 4-department utility authority. Water, wastewater being one, solid waste management being another, public works, which really consists of road maintenance, taking care of the pueblos, windmills for ranching activities, taking care of the irrigation ditch and the Sequia system here. And then our newest addition is the electric division here within the utility authority. We do have plans, and we are working on projects right now for including or expanding our utility authority to include communications. I think that was mentioned at the start of this presentation. We're currently installing about 80,000 feet of fiber optic line, and we are going to be installing towers and broadcasting that and making high-speed internet available to the community via fixed wireless solution, and are also in the process of forming an ISP, an internet service provider, for a tribally owned internet company. We are also in the process of installing about 60 miles of natural gas distribution line. We have about 700, a little under 800 homes and businesses, structures, I would say, here on tribal lands that people reside in and habitat. And only about 1/3 of those have access to natural gas. And so the project, the amount of miles of lines that I mentioned are to make it available for the entire community. And that project will be still owned and operated by the gas company here operating in our area. However, when we renegotiated our right-of-ways and through this joint agreement project, we have built-in tribal tribal ownership in the future. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I was working on, I started working on the energy initiatives here for the Pueblo of Acoma in 2014, but there were several initiatives going back to 2006 here at the Pueblo of Acoma to pursue energy alternatives. The first is, as you can see there, started off with the strategic energy planning session and a report. A couple of years later, we started looking at expanding natural gas and connectivity for all the residents and businesses, and so on and so forth, all the way to where we're at now at the present day is our electric utility start. And just a little bit about this, we've been working on this since 2014, looking at forming an electric utility, and pretty heavily since 2016, with the start date scheduled as of January 1, 2020. Of course, we had to deal with quite a bit of right-of-way issues. Our transmission line in the area, you'll see a slide on that, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but the transmission line doesn't actually cross tribal lands. It's a little bit north of the tribal land, so we had to work with private landowners, with the BLM, with state land office, and others to be able to access the grid, the national grid, the transmission line. So we took a little bit more time negotiating those right-of-ways. We have those in hand now, and our adjusted date after that point in time, after getting the right-of-ways, was the end of March. And then, of course, this COVID pandemic hit, and now we're actually scheduled to energize November 1st. But the point of this is Acoma has been pursuing energy alternatives for several years, and we're really close to achieving one of our big goals. Next slide. So a little bit about how the Pueblo of Acoma decided to form its own tribal electric utility, and most of this was, it didn't have to do with service, reliability. I think we're on par with reliability and service issues and things from our cooperative. I think most of this had to do with really just exercising sovereignty, being able to create jobs here, being able to retain revenue, and just basically having a decision over energy matters. And so this first bullet point is, I'm sure, I've talked to many tribes, going to the DOE annual conferences, going to the REVS conference. We talked to other entities across the country, and I'm surprised of how many tribal communities have issues with their co-ops. And like many others, the Pueblo of Acoma tribal government, tribal businesses, and members get their electricity, or get our electricity, from our local electric cooperative. And the cooperative that serves us has about 25,000 customers, and we make up about 900 of those. But half of the customers, about 13,000, are other tribal communities, including us. But the issue is there's not one single person on their 12-person board of trustees that make those, policy and business decisions, rates, so on and so forth. Not one single person is from any one of the 4 Native communities that do make up half of their customer base. But the primary issue was in 2012, the Pueblo of Acoma did bring up an issue with the co-op because their right-of-way agreement that they had on the Pueblo of Acoma to operate the electric utilities, which was valid from 1950 to 2000, had expired, and they were operating, for 12 years without a valid right-of-way. And that the agreement that was signed back in 1950 provided $1 a year per payment to the Pueblo from the company to operate on tribal lands. And to this day, they still think that's fair compensation because they're providing us electrical service. But our argument would be, we're paying for that electrical service. It's not being provided at free of cost. So after a lot of negotiation, a lot of discussion, a lot of contention, in 2014, the Pueblo of Acoma and the co-op came to an agreement and ultimately led to the Pueblo of Acoma having a pathway to acquire all the electrical facilities on tribal lands. Next slide, please. So while we were going through that process, beginning in 2014 and ending in 2017, the Pueblo of Acoma also went through an extensive effort to perform the necessary due diligence to determine if the Pueblo could viably operate a tribal electric utility. We looked at such things as market available power, substation costs, construction costs for distribution lines, operating costs, which at first we looked at, potentially outsourcing our operation and maintenance, as a contract to a third-party provider. But in the end, we're moving forward with our own in-house staff for operation and maintenance of the distribution system. We also looked at, other operating costs, just cost of running the business, billing, which we are billing for other utilities, so that wasn't so much of a big concern. Outage restoration, all the things that it's going to take to operate and maintain this distribution system, including what our rate structure would be, potential debt service, rate stabilization we're looking at, and many other things. The graph that you see on the side is what the Pueblo of Acoma currently pays retail payment for residential connections to our co-op right now. So it's 10.6 cents per kilowatt hour is the general rate for residential customers. So this is what we knew we had to beat when we looked at this viability. Can we operate our utilities at least at 10.6 cents per kilowatt hour, if not cheaper? And so when we went through those, several rounds of feasibility studies and then a deeper look through the business plan formation, it was ultimately determined that this was a viable business despite our relatively small size and customer base, largely because of the power needs of our casino, larger businesses, and the ability to be able to site any size solar facilities here on tribal lands to both use and market as a supplemental revenue for the entire utility authority operation and the Pueblo as a whole. This was another key point because our local co-op didn't want to issue or forward any renewable credits for energy generation cited in their service territory. Next slide. So as I mentioned, why did the Pueblo of Acoma decide to form its own tribal electric utility? The main reason, of course, is energy sovereignty or enhanced sovereignty, controlling energy decisions, being able to improve quality of service, maintaining and retaining revenue within the community. Each year, the total load, the total payment that goes out to the co-op is around $3 million. And now with our own electric utility being formed in a few months, this revenue will be able to stay within the community, helping out other things such as tax revenue and things of that nature, which really falls into creating jobs, managing reliability, and the big one is being able to pursue renewable power. Next slide, please. So the map that you see on the bottom right of the screen shows the northern portion of the Pueblo of Acoma tribal lands, and the red lines, the faint red lines that you can see there are the current electrical distribution system, and the bold red line is our transmission system, and the green and yellow squares there are other landowners that we had to negotiate right-of-ways with. And it took quite a long time to be able to obtain these right-of-ways, and I would have to say that it was mostly in part due to political reasons. The co-op put a pretty aggressive campaign to stop our separation, both in the newspapers, through direct mail, flyers on windows. There was quite a resistance from the co-op for us to separate, including getting our local congressmen and political appointees involved in the situation. But we were able to move all past that, or get around that, and we're well on our way to form. But we did have to take out a sizable loan to form this tribal electric utility for construction of the substation, distribution lines, performing the assessments, procuring inventory, the tools, equipment, and staffing in order to operate the system. And as I mentioned, we really started heavily 2016 and 2017. We started looking at and really getting hard data, hard numbers, RFPs for wholesale power, things of that nature. And as I mentioned, we were supposed to form already, but with the COVID, it really put a delay in things. But we will be forming here in a couple months. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of what it cost the Pueblo of Acoma, our project was broken up into several phases. The first phase being just an assessment, a high-level look. Second phase was actually taking detailed looks with hard proposals, like as I mentioned, for wholesale power, operation and maintenance, operational costs, things of that nature. And third phase was actually a capacity organizational development, which is not included in part of these costs that you see on the screen, is we were able to secure a grant from the Office of Indian Energy a couple of years ago to help us out with organizational and capacity development for our formation efforts. This also included a working capital loan that we took from our own casino, which is kind of strange to say, but we took a loan from them for working capital once we formed the utility, and helping us pay the cost of operating this business until our revenue stream becomes stable. But overall, I would say it would be about $6.1 million, which does include the grant that we received from the Office of Indian Energy. Next slide, please. And this really basically just shows the many partners that we've been working with, from internal stakeholders, the Office of Indian Energy. We have our consultant, Avant Energy. We have our legal energy team, Stelzner Winter law firm, our co-op there. We've been working with WAPA. We do have hydropower allocations from WAPA that we do receive twice a year through disbursements. Next slide, please. So what are our future plans? And so as you've seen that timeline a few slides ago, we have performed energy audits, some retrofits in the past. We've evaluated microgrid opportunities. We looked at phasing in solar generation, megawatt by megawatt, with a lot of opportunity out there, such as the Department of Energy's deployment grants that are available. But we knew that we were going to be self-connected or independently connected. So that was kind of all on hold. But now that we are interconnected independently with our own substation, our own feeder line, and we'll be in control and own our own distribution system all the way down to the meter on the houses, what do we do next? Next slide. And so, and I think, as Anthony mentioned, energy companies approach us all the time, especially after they learn about our electric utility formation. We get approached at least on a monthly basis of different proposals, everything from rooftop installation to large utility scale siting of large utility scale generation facilities here on tribal lands, and with every type of model in between. I think Lizana was talking about the different I guess assumptions, or not assumptions, but really acceptance of risk, different models of how you want to get things done. What we're looking at right now is something similar to the landowner, I think was their first bullet point, which is basically doing a land lease. And this does have advantages for us because of capital concern issues. We don't have a lot of capital to put in a large facility, and that's, I think, the direction that the Pueblo of Acoma does want to go. So the challenge with this for us is how do we pick the right business partner if we were to use this kind of model? Next slide, please. So one of the things is NREL actually provides assistance through an application process to develop, solar needs within the community. And on our need at that time, or it still is, was to develop an RFP that would help us pick the best business partner to give the Pueblo the most out of potentially siting a utility scale solar here on tribal lands, which would be more than just a land lease. We're looking at things, or potentially looking at things for revenue sharing and ultimately ownership transfer, tribal transfer after a few years. I know the Department of Energy has, like I said, deployment grants that they offer each year through their normal funding cycle. We weren't able to get in this year just because of everything with our formation efforts, but that's a great opportunity. I don't know really the details if they changed much, but last time I heard there were a 50-50 match, up to $1 million of grant funds available for deployment of solar. So we'll certainly be taking advantage of that in the future. But I think at this point, the Pueblo of Acoma is at this time not moving forward with rooftop solar installations. We don't have any land limitations, and operation and maintenance costs I think are more efficient with larger systems. But I think the main reason why we're not looking at that is because we are going to be independently connected out from any co-op or other investor-owned utility or similar. And we don't have to have or develop behind-the-meter solutions. We will be in full control and be able to apply, load for our own usage and then market the rest. But ultimately, the goal is to be in control of our own utilities, not just electric, but and the water and other utilities we manage now, but bringing on broadband and then also natural gas in the near future, where economically feasible. Next slide. I guess that's it. So, yeah, that concludes my presentation. I look forward to any questions, but at this point in time, I'll turn it over to James. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thanks, Arvind. Excellent presentation. Very interesting project and endeavor the Pueblo's pursuing. So, good luck in the next months as you go live. That's an exciting milestone. Yeah, so with that, we're now ready for questions. We do have a little bit of time here, which is unusual for us, so let's try to take advantage of it. Please do submit questions. Audience members, we have a couple, but we'll have time for more. So, submit your written questions and we'll probably be able to get to them. First question here. Originally it was for Anthony, but it can probably be for Anthony and Arvind both. And Arvind, you touched on it a little bit, but you mentioned that you receive a lot of proposals for various energy projects. Are those proposals typically unsolicited? And what are who's submitting them? Are they developers or
sure.
or are they?
Yeah, well, I can answer that. Some are, I would say we get a number of unsolicited proposals, and some are potentially we are maybe working on a grant, for example, if we're working on the microgrid grant or some of the other grants we've done, that information becomes public. So sometimes people will find out that we're actually working on a certain project. So we may actually be interested in it, but not necessarily know who the companies are. It's not to say they're all bad. I think it's just to make sure that I'm sure other people are seeing that out there. I think the more you get out there, the more projects you complete, probably the more proposals you're going to see, and just making sure that it is in line with where your goals are. I think it certainly can be, but I think you do want to be leery. We've had situations where somebody's pitching a project, you kind of shoot that project down, they pull out another folder in the bag, and that's a totally different technology. You shoot that one down, and it had 3 come out of the bag before, and that type of thing is going to make you pretty nervous. So I think it's just being cognizant, aware of sort of those are general things. I mean, sometimes it's just a feel, or you can, by talking to someone, really get an understanding for if they're looking for a mutually beneficial relationship or not.
Yeah, James, this is RV. Just to kind of piggyback on Anthony's comments, all of ours have been unsolicited as well. We get calls and letters and proposals from international companies, developers, as well as domestic here in the States. And that's the thing is, we have conversations with them. We explore and you have calls and conversations with them just to kind of find out what they're thinking. But ultimately, that's why we decided, we don't want to pick these one off. It's a big decision. Any project that you do for the community here is a big decision, and we want to make sure that not only we're partnering up with the right company, but we're getting the most out of it on behalf of the of here for the Pueblo of Acoma. Same thing for any tribe across the country. So that's why we decided to go out and specifically for our solar generation project. We're going to be putting out a proposal here in the next year on a large scale solar. But yeah, it's from big companies to small companies, overseas, investors, developers, you name it.
Great, thanks. Question for you, Arvine. Sounds like you've been through quite a process along the way of getting here with the utility authority, particularly the electric generation side of it, or the electric service side of it. And a lot of the decisions along the way were probably made with uncertainty, where you didn't know maybe how things would turn out. To what do you attribute that perseverance or that ability to succeed over the long term with the uncertainty that undoubtedly was faced along the way?
Well, thank you, James, for that question. So I'm not quite sure that decisions were made with uncertainty. I think in the overall scheme of things, the Pueblo of Acoma leadership, and I mentioned earlier in my presentation, it does. We have an appointment process here for our leadership, and that appointment process takes place every year. So we can have new leadership, new council every year. Typically, that doesn't happen. It's usually every 2 to 3 years. So there's a lot of turnover that happens even in the 6-year period in the life cycle of a project that we have here. But we've been pretty fortunate to have consensus and support, unified support along the way. But I think the main idea was ultimately in the end, regardless of the hardships and how long it has to take us, the Pueblo of Acoma wants to be in control of its own energy decisions, and really that's to support tribal sovereignty. I think the uncertainty in the project was based on some negotiations or some agreements that were in place prior to the team that's working on the project now to be able to work under, and that's really the settlement agreement that we had with the co-op, which there really wasn't any hard deadlines or time frames or checkpoints along the way. So the uncertainty was really driven by the how should I say this? The resistance of our co-op, fighting us tooth and nail every single thing along the way, and there's no time frames in this written agreement that we both entities agree to, that holds anybody to any kind of time frame. And so in the meantime, they know that, and they're pushing things out, knowing that it's going to cost the Pueblo more in legal fees and consulting fees along the way. And but like I said, in the end, the main goal is to make sure that we get this accomplished, and that's what allowed us to persevere and keep pushing this forward.
Great, thanks. One last question here, unless additional come in. Another question for Seneca and Anthony. Why do you think that Seneca Energy has been successful in presenting projects to council? And I guess I'm not 100% sure that council approves all projects, but maybe you can elaborate on just kind of reinforcing the details or maybe the methodology pursued that gives council so much trust
Sure.
or buy-in.
Yeah, you know, we're not perfect, but I think we have had success with presenting projects, and I think the key is, you know, again, leadership at the front end. We have a number of champions within the executive and council offices where, you know, we're really in constant communication, and we also, the council meets weekly, well, every day, but there's certain days where you can go in and present your projects, and I'll get on as many of those agendas, you know, as possible when we're working through these types of projects, and certainly when decisions need to be made along the way, making sure they're informed. You know, I think the worst thing you could do is just try and kind of do it in behind closed doors, I guess, if you will. The more communication, and then really when it gets to council, I think we've had really nice communication along the way where it's actually, I don't want to say made it easy, but it's made it a lot easier to actually get it approved at that final level, because it's not a surprise to anybody. We know that we're achieving the goals, the initiatives that everybody was looking for. You know, again, the leadership helped us craft the vision and those pillars that we really try to go back to every time. So when we're sort of making sure we're focusing on those goals and the overall mission, and then keeping people informed, it's been a pretty successful recipe so far.
Great, thanks, Anthony. With that, there aren't any additional questions at this time. I want to thank each of our presenters for their time and their efforts in preparing their presentations and sharing with us today. To our audience, we are very interested in your suggestions on how to strengthen the value of this training, so please do send us any feedback you have. And finally, on our final slide here, we have the remaining webinars for the 2020 series. The next webinar, titled How to Create Energy Partnerships, or how to create partnerships to advance tribal energy projects, will be held on July 29th of this year at 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. We hope you can join us for that, and thank you for your interest today and attendance, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. This concludes the webinar for today. Good day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.